Sometimes the things we think are there to protect us, or the people we think we know best, turn out to be the exact things that are trying to destroy us. It is a terrifying realization, but it happens more often than you might think. Today, we are going to look at 3 cases where ordinary people went about their daily lives expecting nothing but their usual routines, only to find themselves caught in a terrifying fight for survival against a threat they never saw coming. Our first story takes us to the afternoon of the 22nd of January 2024 in the city of Newcastle, England. An elderly woman named Janet Lee was sitting in front of her computer in an office on the 2nd floor of her home. It was a cold, typical gray afternoon, and Janet was trying to focus on her recent bank statements. But it was incredibly hard for her to concentrate. She was constantly distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. Janet's boyfriend was a man named Richard O'Connell. He and Janet had been together for about 20 years now. Even though they were not officially married, they functioned just like any married couple. They lived together, they shared their daily routines, and they planned their future together. In fact, Janet loved Richard so much and trusted him so completely that she had even written him into her will, ensuring he would be taken care of if anything happened to her. But lately, their relationship had become pretty rocky. In the weeks leading up to this afternoon, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Nothing was set in stone, and they had not made a final decision, but the mere mention of a breakup was a sudden, heavy possibility that was really hard for Janet to deal with. As she sat upstairs in her office, trying to make sense of the numbers on her screen, she kept getting completely sidetracked by the sound of Richard's voice downstairs. She could not stop wondering what would happen if they broke up. What would her life look like? Where would she go? Her mind wandered far away from her bank statements, filled with a deep sense of uncertainty about the future. And then, as Janet was lost in these thoughts, she suddenly heard Richard start yelling downstairs. At first, it sounded like he might just be calling out to the person he had been talking to. But as Janet stopped and listened more closely, the tone of his voice changed. He was not just shouting. He was screaming in intense pain. It was a sound of pure agony. Janet immediately pushed her chair back, ran out of her office, and rushed down the stairs to see what was happening. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked toward the front door. She saw a man walking out. He was wearing a white lab coat, a medical mask, and glasses. His back was to her, and he quickly slipped out the door and closed it behind him. Before Janet could even begin to process who this strange man was or what he was doing in her home, she heard Richard groan. She turned toward the living room and saw Richard clutching his shoulder. He was grimacing, his face pale, rocking back and forth in obvious, intense physical distress. Janet rushed over to him, panic rising in her chest. She asked him what was wrong, what had happened, and who that man was. Richard, breathing heavily and grinding his teeth, told her that he had just received a COVID-19 vaccine booster shot and it hurt incredibly bad. He explained that the man who had just left was a nurse from the National Health Service, or the NHS, who had come by the house to administer the shot. Janet listened to his explanation, but it did not make sense to her. She wondered why Richard was getting a routine vaccine administered at home by a traveling nurse instead of going to a local pharmacy or a doctor's clinic. It felt highly unusual. But as she looked at Richard, she realized that his pain was very real and very severe. He was moaning, holding his arm tight against his chest, and could barely stand still. She decided to put her questions aside and focus on helping him. She asked him if he wanted her to drive him to the hospital right away. But Richard shook his head. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down, and said that the nurse had told him this specific vaccine had a very strong physical reaction. The nurse had assured him that severe pain at the injection site was normal and would fade on its own. Richard insisted they just wait it out. Janet was still deeply worried, but since Richard seemed confident in what the nurse had told him, she decided to respect his wish. She went back upstairs to her office, though she could no longer focus on her bank statements at all. But the pain did not go away. Over the next 48 hours, Richard's condition grew progressively worse. The spot on his arm where he had been injected began to swell. It turned a dark, angry red, and then it began to blister and bleed. By the second day, the tissue around the wound had turned completely black. It looked as if his flesh was literally rotting on his body. Terrified by what they were seeing, Janet put her foot down, got Richard into the car, and rushed him to the emergency room. At the hospital, the doctors took one look at Richard's arm and rushed him into an examination room. The diagnosis was horrifying. Richard was suffering from necrotizing fasciitis, a severe and rapidly spreading bacterial infection commonly known as flesh-eating disease. The bacteria were destroying the skin, fat, and muscle tissue in his arm, essentially rotting him from the inside out. The doctors told Richard that he needed emergency surgery immediately to cut away the dead and dying flesh to stop the infection from spreading to his bloodstream and killing him. But before they wheeled him into surgery, the medical team needed to understand how this had happened. Necrotizing fasciitis usually requires a pathway into the body, like a contaminated wound. Richard explained that the symptoms had started immediately after he received his booster shot from the NHS nurse at his home. As Richard described the encounter to the doctors, Janet sat nearby, listening intently. Richard went into detail about the nurse's appearance, mentioning his height, his build, the way he carried himself, and his slightly unusual accent under his medical mask. And as Richard spoke, something suddenly clicked in Janet's mind. A wave of cold, paralyzing horror washed over her. She realized why the man in the white lab coat had looked so strangely familiar to her when she saw him walking out the door. It was not a stranger. It was not an NHS nurse at all. It turns out the man who had entered their home was Janet's own son, Thomas Kwan. Thomas Kwan was a respected, practicing general practitioner, a medical doctor who knew exactly how the healthcare system worked. But he had not come to his mother's house to help. He had arrived in an elaborate disguise, wearing a fake beard, a mustache, a clinical mask, protective eyewear, and a wig. He had used his medical knowledge to forge official-looking NHS letters, complete with logos and reference numbers, which he had sent to Richard to convince him that he was scheduled for a routine home vaccination. When the police were called to the hospital, they launched an immediate and massive investigation. They went to the house in Newcastle, secured neighbors' security camera footage, and began tracking the movements of the mysterious nurse. The footage showed a disguised man arriving and leaving the property, and the police were able to trace his vehicle back to Thomas Kwan's residence in Sunderland. When detectives raided Thomas's home, they discovered a terrifying scene. He had established a secret laboratory space containing a massive collection of dangerous chemicals and lethal poisons, including ricin, cyanide, and a highly toxic industrial pesticide called iodimethane. On his computer, detectives found a digital diary and detailed search histories showing that Thomas had been planning the murder for months. He had researched lethal doses, how to administer poisons undetected, and had even installed tracking software on his mother's phone to monitor her daily movements so he would know exactly when she would be home and when she would be upstairs. The motive behind this horrific act was pure greed and resentment. Thomas had discovered that his mother had written Richard into her will, and he was absolutely furious. He was convinced that Richard was a gold digger who was going to steal his inheritance and get his hands on his mother's valuable house. Thomas decided that the only way to secure the inheritance for himself was to eliminate Richard. He planned to inject him with a lethal substance, hoping it would look like a sudden, tragic medical complication from a vaccine, shielding him from any suspicion. But instead of a clean, silent poison, Thomas had injected Richard with iodimethane. The industrial pesticide immediately caused severe chemical burns within Richard's muscle tissue, leading to the rapid development of the flesh-eating bacteria. Richard survived the ordeal, but only after undergoing multiple intense, painful surgeries and skin grafts to save his arm. He was left with permanent physical scars and deep psychological trauma. As for Thomas Kwan, his elaborate plan fell completely apart under the weight of the forensic evidence. He was arrested, put on trial, and convicted of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to 31 years in prison. Janet was left to pick up the pieces of her life, carrying the devastating knowledge that her own son had attempted to murder the man she loved out of nothing but cold, calculated greed. Sometimes the danger comes from a family member hiding behind a complex disguise. But other times, the danger is something completely invisible, waiting for us in the most beautiful, peaceful places, just like what happened to a young woman named Angela Lyons. On a bright, sunny afternoon in August of 2014, a 24-year-old tourist from Glasgow, Scotland, who we will call Angela Lyons, was riding a rented moped through the busy, chaotic streets of Vietnam. Angela had arrived in the country about a week earlier, and so far her vacation had been absolutely perfect. She had spent her days exploring the vibrant city, visiting bustling nightclubs, trying incredible local street food, and swimming in beautiful, cool rivers to escape the tropical heat. She felt completely free and happy. As she cruised slowly down a busy street on her moped, she was taking in the sights and sounds of the city, looking at the colorful shop fronts. For just a second, she turned her head to look at something on the side of the road. But in that split second, the traffic in front of her slowed down. When she looked back, she couldn't react in time. Her moped hit another scooter in front of her with a loud crash, and Angela was thrown off her bike, tumbling onto the hard concrete pavement. She hit her head pretty hard on the ground. Fortunately, she was wearing a helmet which absorbed the brunt of the impact. Shaken but determined to stay calm, Angela stood up and assessed her body. She seemed to be physically fine, with no major cuts or broken bones. The driver of the other moped was also unhurt, and both of their bikes had escaped any serious damage. They apologized to each other, nodded, and decided to just go their separate ways. Angela walked over to the side of the road, took off her helmet, and ran her fingers through her hair to check her scalp. She felt a small, tender bump where her head had made contact with the road, but it did not seem serious. She briefly considered going to a local medical clinic just to get checked out, but decided against it. It was a very small bump, and she did not want to spend her precious vacation time waiting in a hospital. She put her helmet back on, got back on her moped, and continued her trip. She spent a few more days in Vietnam, enjoying the warm weather and swimming in the local freshwater rivers before finally boarding her flight back to Scotland. But almost as soon as she landed back home in Glasgow, she began to experience a very strange and highly alarming new symptom. Out of nowhere, her nose began to bleed. And these were not minor, occasional nosebleeds. They were sudden, heavy, and occurred multiple times a day, pouring blood without any warning. Terrified that she had sustained some kind of internal head injury or a brain bleed from her moped accident, Angela immediately made an appointment to see her primary care doctor. She sat in the examination room and explained everything to the doctor, telling him about the moped crash, the bump on her head, and the severe nosebleeds that had started the moment she returned to Scotland. The doctor listened carefully, examined her head and her nose, and checked her vitals. But after he was finished, he smiled and shook his head. He told Angela that he did not believe her nosebleeds had anything to do with the moped crash. He pointed out that the bump on her head had already completely healed and there were no signs of concussion. Instead, he explained that her body was likely just having a hard time adjusting to the dramatic change in weather. She had gone from the extreme humid heat of Vietnam to the cold, dry air of Scotland, which can cause the delicate blood vessels inside the nasal passages to dry out and burst. The doctor recommended that Angela apply a small amount of Vaseline inside her nostrils several times a day to keep the tissue moist and lubricated. He assured her that once her body fully transitioned back to the local climate, the nosebleeds would stop. Angela felt incredibly relieved. She went home, bought a jar of Vaseline, and began applying it diligently every morning and evening. But the nosebleeds did not stop. If anything, they got worse. They became more frequent, and she found herself constantly carrying tissues everywhere she went. A few days later, Angela was in her bathroom, getting ready to take a warm shower. She applied some Vaseline to her nose, turned on the water, and stepped inside the steaming tub. As she stood under the warm water, she began gently feeling her nose, trying to see if there was any internal swelling. As she pressed her fingers against her nostril, she felt something strange and solid deep inside her nasal cavity. It felt like a firm, unusual blockage. Curious and frustrated, she pressed down hard on the outside of her nose, trying to feel what it was. The moment she applied pressure, a blinding, white-hot wave of pain shot through her face. She gasped, and instantly a torrent of blood began pouring out of her nose. It was not a typical nosebleed. It was a heavy, continuous flow of blood that she could not stop. The blood covered her hands and stained the shower floor. Panic seized her. She jumped out of the shower, wrapped herself in a towel, and tried to pack her nose with tissues, but the blood kept soaking through them. She was convinced that she was suffering from a catastrophic brain hemorrhage from the moped crash that the doctor had completely missed. Shaking with fear, she threw on some clothes, ran to her car, and drove straight to the nearest hospital emergency room. When she arrived, the emergency room staff saw how pale and terrified she was and quickly brought her into an exam room. A nurse instructed her to sit down, tilt her head back, and keep pressure on her nose. The nurse then took a medical light and speculum forceps and began looking into Angela's nostrils. Angela sat perfectly still, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the nurse to tell her what was wrong. But as the minutes ticked by, the room became incredibly quiet. The nurse did not say a word. She was completely motionless. Feeling a sudden wave of unease, Angela slowly tilted her head down to look at the nurse. The nurse was standing there, frozen. Her eyes were wide with a look of absolute horror and disbelief. She was staring into Angela's nose as if she had just seen something impossible. The nurse quickly tried to compose herself, looked at Angela, and told her to stay extremely calm while she went to get the doctor. Before Angela could even ask what was happening, the nurse turned and rushed out of the room. A few minutes later, a doctor arrived with specialized tools. He leaned in, examined Angela's nose, and confirmed what the nurse had seen. It turned out that Angela's primary care doctor had been right about one thing. The nosebleeds had nothing to do with her moped accident. But they were not caused by the Scottish weather either. While Angela had been swimming in the beautiful freshwater rivers of Vietnam, a tiny, microscopic creature had swam up her nose. It was a juvenile leech. Once inside her warm, dark, and highly vascular nasal cavity, the leech had latched onto her sinus tissue and began feeding on her blood. Over the next several weeks, as Angela traveled back to Scotland, the leech grew larger and larger, completely undetected. By the time she stood in the hospital, the leech had grown to a massive 3 inches in length. It had been living deep inside her sinus cavity, separated from her brain only by a paper-thin bone called the cribriform plate, which is only about 0.5 millimeter thick. Every time Angela experienced a sudden nosebleed, it was actually the leech feeding and moving around inside her face. When she had pressed down hard on her nose in the shower, she had squeezed the leech, causing it to bite down in pain and rupture a major blood vessel, triggering the massive hemorrhage. The doctor had to perform a highly delicate and uncomfortable procedure. Using long, thin forceps and a local anesthetic, he carefully reached deep into Angela's nose to grasp the slippery, writhing parasite. He had to be extremely careful not to tear the leech, which would leave its mouthparts embedded in her tissue, potentially causing a severe infection. After 30 tense, agonizing minutes, the doctor slowly pulled the 3-inch-long black leech out of Angela's nose. Angela watched in utter disgust as the wet, writhing creature was placed into a medical tray. With the parasite finally removed, her nose was cleaned and the bleeding stopped. Angela went on to make a full physical recovery, but the psychological horror of knowing a giant blood-sucking worm had been living inside her face for weeks was something she would never truly get over. It is terrifying to think about what can enter our bodies when we are just trying to enjoy a beautiful vacation. But our final story shows that sometimes the most deadly poison is introduced to us slowly over months by someone we share our home with. In February of 1987, a 45-year-old woman named Janet Overton stood in front of her bathroom mirror inside her beautiful home in Dana Point, California. Janet was a highly respected and active member of her community. She served on the school board for the Capistrano Unified School District, where her 17-year-old son Eric went to school. She had a major school board meeting scheduled for later that day, and she was determined to attend. But as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she looked absolutely terrible. Her skin was a sickly, pale yellow, and she had deep, dark purple circles under her eyes. Janet knew why she looked this way. For the past couple of days, she had been feeling incredibly sick out of nowhere. She was completely congested, felt constantly fatigued, and suffered from sudden, violent waves of nausea that kept her awake at night. She figured she had just contracted a particularly bad winter cold or a flu virus. Janet was a very strong-willed woman, and she hated showing weakness or canceling her obligations. She decided that instead of going to the doctor, she would just tough it out. She applied a thick layer of heavy makeup to cover up her pale complexion, styled her hair, drank a hot cup of coffee, and walked out the door to her meeting. But as the weeks went by, Janet's condition did not get any better. In fact, it steadily got worse. One night, she woke up in the middle of the night with a wave of nausea so violent that she barely made it to the bathroom before she began vomiting. She was left sitting on the cold bathroom floor, sweating, shaking, and gasping for breath. She had finally gone to see a doctor, but the medical examinations had yielded no clear answers. The doctor agreed that she was likely fighting a persistent, stubborn viral infection and told her to get plenty of rest and stay hydrated. But rest did not help. The nausea became a constant, agonizing presence in her life, making it nearly impossible for her to eat. She began to lose weight rapidly, and she became so weak that she could barely stand up. She began falling behind on her important work with the school board because she simply did not have the energy to function. One night, as she was splashing cold water on her face in the bathroom, she noticed a new and alarming symptom. She saw a strange, red, scaly rash on her arms. She pulled her sleeves up and saw that the rash extended all the way up her arms, onto her shoulders, her neck, and down her back. When she touched it, it burned with a sharp, agonizing pain. This was a brand new symptom, and it was clear to Janet that it had to be connected to whatever mystery illness was destroying her body. Terrified by how rapidly her health was deteriorating, she decided she could no longer ignore it. She went to the emergency room. The next day, Janet was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm. Her husband, Richard Overton, a highly intelligent man with a doctorate in psychology, sat faithfully at our bedside along with their son, Eric. Janet looked incredibly frail. The red rash had now spread to her neck and face, where it had begun to form painful blisters. The hospital doctors ran a series of advanced tests, looking for everything from autoimmune diseases to rare infections. But every single test came back negative. She did not have the flu, she did not have any known infection, and her blood work showed no obvious abnormalities. However, an abdominal scan did reveal something concrete. Janet's stomach was covered in deep, bleeding ulcers. The doctors explained that these ulcers were the direct cause of her severe nausea and inability to keep food down. But they could not explain why a healthy, active 45-year-old woman would suddenly develop such severe ulcers. With no clear diagnosis, the doctors could only treat her symptoms. They put her on heavy ulcer medication and gave her specialized topical creams for her painful, blistering rash. Surprisingly, the treatments worked. Over the next few days, her stomach settled, the rash began to fade, and she regained enough strength to be discharged from the hospital. Janet and her family returned home, hoping that this bizarre, terrifying medical nightmare was finally over. But it was not. Over the next several months, a cruel and exhausting cycle began. Janet would feel perfectly healthy for a few weeks, only to suddenly fall violently ill again with the exact same symptoms. She would develop severe nausea, extreme weakness, and the painful, blistering rash. She was hospitalized multiple times, but each time the doctors were completely baffled, treated her symptoms, and sent her home once she stabilized. By the 24th of January, 1988, Janet was determined to have a good day. She and her son, Eric, had planned an exciting whale-watching trip. She woke up feeling terrible, experiencing the familiar onset of nausea and weakness. But she refused to let her mysterious illness ruin this special day with her son. She went through her routine to hide her sickness. She applied a heavy layer of foundation and blush to cover her pale skin. She styled her hair, drank a freshly brewed cup of hot coffee to give herself a boost of energy, and walked downstairs to meet Eric. Together, they walked out of the house and stepped onto the driveway. Janet approached the passenger side of the family car. She reached out her hand, her fingers inches from the door handle. Suddenly, she froze. She gasps, her eyes went wide, and she collapsed onto the concrete driveway. Eric and his father, Richard, rushed to her side, desperately calling for help. They transported her to the hospital as quickly as possible. But by the time they arrived, it was already too late. Janet Overton was pronounced dead. The medical community was stunned. A woman who had been suffering from a mysterious undulating illness for over a year had suddenly dropped dead. Because of the unusual circumstances surrounding her death, a coroner was called to perform a thorough autopsy to determine once and for all what had killed Janet. During the autopsy, the coroner made the initial incision and opened Janet's stomach. As he did, he was immediately struck by a highly distinct, powerful aroma filling the room. It was a sweet, bitter scent, resembling the smell of wild almonds. The coroner immediately recognized this smell. It was the signature scent of cyanide. The coroner halted the autopsy and immediately contacted the local police department. Detectives were dispatched to the Overton home in Dana Point. They began a comprehensive search of the property, seizing various items including Janet's personal belongings, cosmetics, food, and beverages. The physical evidence was sent to a forensic toxicology laboratory for analysis. The results of the tests were shocking and broke the mystery wide open. The detectives discovered that Janet had not been suffering from a rare, mysterious medical illness at all. She was being systematically and slowly poisoned. Forensic analysis of her makeup, specifically her eyeliner and foundation, revealed they were heavily contaminated with selenium, a trace mineral that is highly toxic to humans in large doses. Prolonged selenium poisoning causes severe nausea, extreme fatigue, hair loss, and a painful, peeling skin rash that blisters. This was the source of the mysterious burning rash that the doctors could never diagnose. Every time Janet caked on heavy makeup to hide her illness and look presentable, she was actually rubbing a highly toxic chemical directly into her skin, allowing it to absorb into her bloodstream and slowly poison her body. But the selenium was a slow killer, designed to make her suffer and slowly waste away. The final fatal blow had come on the morning of the 24th of January, 1988. Forensic testing of the coffee cup Janet drank from before her collapse revealed a lethal concentration of cyanide. The cyanide acted instantly, shutting down her body's ability to use oxygen and causing her immediate collapse and death. The police turned their full attention to her husband, Richard Overton. As they dug into Richard's background and personal life, they uncovered a dark and disturbing motive. Richard, despite his professional standing as a psychologist, was a deeply jealous, controlling, and resentful man. He had become absolutely convinced that Janet was having an extramarital affair. The police found that Richard had access to highly toxic chemicals through his professional networks and interests. Most damning of all, they discovered his personal journals, which were written in a highly complex, self-made shorthand code. When experts deciphered the code, they found that Richard had kept a meticulous daily record of his suspicions, tracking Janet's schedule and documenting her physical decline. In his diary, Richard had documented exactly how he was secretly placing selenium in her makeup and watching her suffer. He had also documented his decision to end her life with a fatal dose of cyanide when the slow selenium poisoning was taking too long. Richard Overton was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was a massive sensation in Orange County, California. The prosecution presented the deciphered coded diaries, the contaminated makeup, the cyanide-laced coffee cup, and the expert testimony of the coroner. Despite Richard's defense attempting to claim that Janet's death was a suicide or due to natural causes, the jury was convinced by the overwhelming forensic evidence. In 1995, Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He continued to maintain his innocence from behind bars, but all of his appeals were denied. He died in a state prison in 2009. The tragic story of Janet Overton leaves a lingering, haunting resonance. A dedicated mother, public servant, and beloved community member was slowly tortured and ultimately murdered by the very person she trusted most, her husband, who watched her suffer for over a year, pretending to comfort her while secretly ensuring her demise. These three cases show us that sometimes the world is far more dangerous than we realize. Whether it is a greedy family member hiding behind a medical disguise, a silent parasite waiting in a beautiful river, or a jealous spouse hiding poison in the everyday items we trust, the line between safety and tragedy is often incredibly thin. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In 1993, David Lewis was a man who seemed to have it all. He was a successful and well-respected lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas. He had a loving wife, Karen, and a beautiful 9-year-old daughter. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, the kind of guy who coached his daughter's sports teams and spent his free time helping out with local charities. His life was stable, predictable, and happy. On January 28th of that year, a Thursday, Karen and their daughter were getting ready for a fun weekend trip. They were heading to Dallas, a few hours away, for a mother-daughter shopping spree. It was something they were both really looking forward to. Normally, David would have tagged along, making a family trip out of it. But this particular weekend was a big one for sports fans. The Super Bowl was on that Sunday, the 31st, and David didn't want to miss it. He was a huge fan and wanted to enjoy the game from the comfort of his own home. So he said his goodbyes, and Karen and their daughter drove off to Dallas, leaving David to have the house to himself for a couple of days. They had their trip, and then on Sunday, after the big game had finished, they made the drive back home to Amarillo. As they pulled into the driveway, they were expecting to walk in and find David either cleaning up some game day snacks or maybe watching the post-game analysis. When they stepped inside, the house was quiet. The first thing Karen noticed was that the TV was still on, tuned to the channel that had just aired the Super Bowl. That wasn't too strange. But David was nowhere to be found. Karen called out his name, but there was no answer. She walked through the familiar rooms of their home, a little confused but not yet worried. She figured maybe he had gotten a last-minute invitation to watch the second half at a friend's house and just hadn't called. She noticed the VCR was still recording. This was classic David. He was known for recording all the major sporting events so he could watch them again later. The fact that the VCR was still running meant he hadn't been the one to turn it off. It was just another small, slightly odd detail. Karen continued her search, calling his name. She went into the kitchen, and that's when things started to feel a little more unsettling. She opened the refrigerator door, maybe looking for a note, or just seeing what was inside. And there, on a shelf, was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches. This was a sandwich David made all the time, his go-to snack. But why would he make 2 sandwiches and then just leave them in the fridge, uneaten? It didn't make sense. She closed the fridge door and turned around. On the kitchen counter, she saw something that made her pause. It was David's wedding band and his watch, just sitting there. Now, this was truly strange. A man might forget his wallet, but leaving behind his wedding ring and his watch was different. It felt personal. Still, Karen tried to rationalize it. There were no signs of a break-in. Nothing was stolen or out of place. There was absolutely no evidence of a struggle. The house was exactly as it should be, just without David in it. Her best guess was that he had simply stepped out in a hurry and would be back soon. So, Karen waited up for a while, but as the hours ticked by, she eventually went to bed, telling herself he would surely be there in the morning. But when she woke up the next day, the other side of the bed was still empty. David had not come home. Now, real worry began to set in. The strange little details from the night before suddenly felt much more sinister. She knew something was wrong. She called the police and reported her husband missing. The Amarillo police began their investigation immediately. It didn't take them long to find a major clue. Within 24 hours, they located David's car. It was parked and abandoned in a downtown lot not far from the courthouse where he often worked. When they searched the vehicle, they found his keys, both for the car and the house, tucked away under one of the floor mats. Inside the car, everything seemed to be in order. His checkbook was there. His credit cards were in the glove compartment. His driver's license was right where it should be. Nothing of value had been taken. Investigators then looked into his recent financial activity, and that's when the story took another strange turn. They saw he had recently made a deposit of $5,000 into the family bank account. That seemed more like someone planning for their family's future than someone in trouble. But then they found something else. He had also recently purchased 2 one-way plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas back to Amarillo. Police couldn't determine if he had actually used these tickets, but it added to a growing theory that maybe David had chosen to disappear. When the police presented all of this to Karen, the abandoned car, the untouched valuables, the bank activity, she told them something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. She said that just before he disappeared, David had told her that he believed his life might be in danger. He was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month. It was for a complicated conflict of interest case involving his old law firm and one of their very wealthy, very powerful clients. According to Karen, David was being heavily pressured by his former colleagues to lie to cover up some of the firm's wrongdoings. But David was an honest man. He had told his family that he was going to tell the absolute truth in his deposition, no matter whose reputation it destroyed. He knew this decision would make him a lot of enemies. He understood that telling the truth put a huge target on his back. This information was a bombshell. The police were certainly intrigued. It painted a picture of a man caught in a dangerous situation, not one who would just walk away from his family. But the problem was, it was just a story. They had no hard evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David Lewis. It was a compelling theory, but without proof, it was just that, a theory. For the next 11 months, investigators followed every lead they could find. They interviewed his former colleagues. They looked into the wealthy client from the lawsuit, but they found nothing. No new information surfaced. There were no sightings of David. He never called home. He never used his credit cards or his social security number. He had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the face of the earth. After nearly a year with no progress, the police officially decided to close the case. The official conclusion was that David Lewis had left of his own accord. They ruled out foul play. For David's family, this was a devastating blow. They had to try and accept the unacceptable, that David was gone, and they would likely never know what truly happened to him. The years passed, and the mystery of his disappearance remained a painful, open wound. Then, in 2004, 11 years after David vanished, something incredible happened. A state trooper in Washington State was sitting at his computer browsing the internet. He had an interest in unsolved mysteries and was looking through old cold cases. He clicked on a page and a picture of David Lewis popped up on his screen. The trooper stared at the photo. He felt an immediate jolt of recognition. The face looked exactly like an unidentified victim from a hit-and-run case he had worked on way back in 1993. His heart pounding, he pulled up the old case file. The details matched up in a chilling way. The John Doe victim had been struck by a vehicle and killed just one day after David Lewis was reported missing in Texas. The man had been found on the side of Highway 24 inches, rural Washington State, a staggering 1,600 miles away from Amarillo. When he was found, this John Doe was dressed from head to toe in military-style clothing. He had no wallet, no identification, and no luggage or bags of any kind. He was just walking aimlessly down the side of a remote highway. Despite the immense distance and the strange circumstances, the trooper felt a growing certainty that this was David. But as he looked back at the picture of David Lewis, he noticed David was wearing glasses. He tried to remember if the John Doe from 1993 had been wearing glasses, and he didn't think so. It was a small detail, but it could be the one that proved him wrong. Just to be sure, he checked the evidence log, the list of personal belongings found on the body, and there it was. The John Doe did have a pair of glasses on him. And when he saw the description, it was a perfect match to the exact same kind of glasses David was wearing in his photo. It wasn't long before DNA testing was done, and the results came back as a definitive match. The John Doe from Washington was without a doubt David Lewis. After 11 long years, the mystery of where David went was finally solved. But it only opened up an even bigger, more disturbing mystery. Why? Why would David travel 1,600 miles to Washington, a state where he had no friends, no family, and no connections whatsoever? If he was the one who hit the record button on his VCR on Super Bowl night, that meant he had less than 24 hours to get from Amarillo, Texas, to that remote highway in Washington. He did it without his car, without his credit cards, and seemingly without any luggage. Where did the military clothing come from? Did he buy it? Or did someone make him wear it? What was he doing walking down that highway in the middle of nowhere? David's family has always believed that he was a victim of foul play. They believe his own words to his wife that his life was in danger because of the testimony he was about to give. They believe someone abducted him from his home, drove him across the country, and killed him, staging it to look like a random accident. But officially, the case remains closed. The police maintain that David Lewis left his home voluntarily, and his death on that lonely highway was nothing more than a tragic accident. In the year 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old woman living a quiet life in Houston, Texas. She worked as a loan officer at a Chase bank and was happily married to her husband, Jay. On the morning of October 12th, a Thursday, everything seemed perfectly normal. Mary Lou said goodbye to Jay and left for her job at the bank, just like she did every other weekday. That afternoon, Jay decided to give his wife a call at work just to check in. But she didn't pick up her phone. He left her a voicemail, figuring she was just busy with a customer and didn't think much of it. But as the afternoon wore on and she didn't call him back, a small seed of concern started to grow. This was very out of character for Mary Lou. She always returned his calls. By 5 p.m., when Mary Lou should have been finishing up her workday, Jay still hadn't heard from her. He called her again, but once more, the call went straight to voicemail. Now, his concern was turning into real worry. He decided to call Mary Lou's supervisor at the bank. The supervisor picked up, and Jay asked if he could speak to his wife. And the supervisor's response sent a chill down his spine. He told Jay that Mary Lou hadn't come into work at all that day. They had tried to get in touch with her as well, but couldn't reach her. In that moment, Jay knew something was terribly wrong. He immediately hung up and dialed 911, reporting his wife missing. The police had barely even started their search for Mary Lou when another call came into the station. It was from a man who had been riding his ATV on a remote dirt road about 3 miles from the Morris's home. He told the dispatcher that he had just stumbled upon a smoldering, burnt-out car, and he could see what looked like a body in the driver's seat. It turned out that the fire department had actually received a call earlier that day, around 10 inches the morning, about smoke being seen in that same area. But at the time, they had assumed it was just a controlled burn on someone's property, so they didn't send a unit out to investigate. When police and emergency services arrived at the scene, they found the car was completely destroyed by the fire. The body inside was so badly burned that it was impossible to visually identify who it was. Investigators carefully sifted through the wreckage, and they were able to find a small tooth fragment. They sent it off for testing, and soon their worst fears were confirmed. Dental records proved that the victim was indeed Mary Lou Morris. It was immediately clear to investigators that this was no accident. This was a homicide. They found evidence that gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the interior of the car before it was set ablaze. It seemed the killer had tried to stage the scene, perhaps to make it look like a suicide or a tragic car fire. But because of the intense damage from the fire, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. They didn't know if Mary Lou was already deceased when she was placed in the car, or if the fire itself was what killed her. As police processed the scene, they noted that a number of Mary Lou's valuables, like her purse, were still inside the car. But one very important item was missing. Her wedding ring was not on her finger. The news of Mary Lou's brutal murder shocked her family and the entire community. She was known as a kind, gentle person who didn't have a single enemy in the world. No one could understand why anyone would want to hurt her. The day after her body was found, the case took another bizarre turn. A local Houston newspaper received a phone call from an anonymous man. All he said was, Mary Lou's death was an accident. The reporter on the line tried to press him for more information, asking who he was and what he meant, but the man simply hung up. The call was untraceable. At the exact same time this tragedy was unfolding for the Morris family, a completely separate drama was playing out for another woman in Houston. Her name, coincidentally, was also Mary Morris. This was 9-year-old. Mary McGinnis Morris. She was a successful and well-liked nurse practitioner. She generally got along with everyone at the clinic where she worked, with one notable exception. A new male nurse, a man named Dwayne Young, had recently started working there, and he was making her feel extremely uncomfortable. He seemed to have a problem with her for no apparent reason. One day, Mary McGinnis returned to her desk after seeing a patient and found something deeply disturbing. All of the framed photos of her family that she kept on her desk had been turned face down. And in the very center of her desk was a small piece of paper with 3 words written on it, death to her. She knew, in her gut, that it had to be Dwayne. But she had no proof. That night, she went home and told her husband Mike about what had happened. She told him about Dwayne and the note, and she said, I don't feel safe at work anymore. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? Mike agreed. He took her to a range and taught her how to handle a firearm safely. He then bought her a small pistol, which she started keeping tucked under the driver's seat of her car, just in case. On October 16th, 4 days after Mary Lou Morris's body was found, and 3 days after that strange anonymous call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris finished her shift at the clinic and stopped at a drugstore on her way home. As soon as she walked inside, she noticed a man on the other side of the store who seemed to be watching her every move. She felt a wave of fear and immediately pulled out her cell phone and called her best friend, Lori. She described the strange man to Lori and asked what she should do. Lori told her to just wait, to pretend to shop until the man left the store. But the man didn't leave. He just stayed there, lingering in an aisle, staring at her. Finally, Mary McGinnis decided she couldn't wait any longer. She told Lori, you know what, I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I have to make a quick stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be fine. She hung up the phone, walked to the register, bought her items, and left the store. Just 12 minutes later, a frantic 911 call came in. It was Mary McGinnis Morris. The dispatcher could hear the sheer terror in her voice as she screamed that someone was trying to kill her. The contents of that 911 call have never been made public, reportedly because on the recording, you can actually hear the moment she is attacked. Later that night, Mary McGinnis was found in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her terrified 911 call that this was a homicide. But just like with the first Mary Morris, her killer had attempted to stage the scene to look like a suicide. The murder weapon, which was her own pistol that she kept under her seat, had been carefully placed on the seat next to her hand. None of her valuables had been stolen from the car. But, just like Mary Lou Morris, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After the murder of the second Mary Morris, police and the public began to speculate that these two cases had to be connected. It was just too much of a coincidence. Two women, sharing the same name, living in the same city, murdered within days of each other. In both cases, the crime scenes were staged to look self-inflicted. And in both cases, the victim's wedding ring was taken. A chilling theory began to form. This was a professional hit gone horribly wrong. The people who subscribed to this theory believed that Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target all along, and that the murder of Mary Lou Morris was a tragic mistake. They reasoned that a hitman was hired, given the name Mary Morris and a general location, and he simply killed the wrong woman first. Then, upon realizing his mistake, he was the one who anonymously called the newspaper to say her death was an accident. And a few days later, the hit was successfully carried out on the correct target, Mary McGinnis Morris. The detail about the missing wedding rings supported this theory, as it's reportedly a common practice for hitmen to take a personal item like that to prove to their client that the job is done. Police took this theory very seriously and began looking into who might want Mary McGinnis Morris dead. Their attention quickly turned to her husband, Mike. They discovered that he had recently accused her of having an affair and was said to be extremely angry about it. He also behaved suspiciously after her murder, refusing to take a polygraph test and not allowing the police to interview his daughter. And then there was the motive. Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy, and Mike was the sole beneficiary. It seemed like a classic case of a husband hiring a hitman to kill his wife. But when investigators dug deeper, they couldn't find a single piece of evidence that tied Mike to either his wife's murder or the murder of Mary Lou Morris. As for her creepy coworker, Dwayne Young, who wrote the death to her note, police determined that while he clearly disliked her, he was not involved in her death. And so, both of these incredibly strange and tragic cases went cold. To this day, no one has ever been arrested or charged in either murder. In 1996, Blair Adams was a 31-year-old man living in Surrey, a suburb of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. In his past, he had some struggles with alcoholism and substance abuse, but for the last 2 years, he had completely turned his life around. He was clean, sober, and had landed a great job as a foreman for a local construction company. He was known as a friendly, cheerful guy who was easy to get along with and had no known enemies. But in the summer of that year, something changed in Blair. He started exhibiting strange and uncharacteristic mood swings. His mother would later describe them as being frequent and wild. In just a matter of weeks, the calm, relaxed, and friendly man she knew transformed into someone who was constantly panicked and on edge. He was always looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. The stress was so intense that he couldn't sleep at night. He began telling his friends and coworkers that he was convinced someone was trying to kill him. They were concerned, telling him that he wasn't okay and that he really needed to see a doctor. When his mother confronted him about his increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior, he was secretive. He told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." She pressed him, asking, "What's it?" But he just shook his head and said, "I can't say anything else." And that was all she could ever get out of him. Blair's strange behavior reached a crisis point on Friday, July 5th. He went to his bank and withdrew his entire life savings in cash, a total of $6,000. He then went to his safety deposit box and emptied it as well. It contained thousands of dollars worth of gold, platinum, and expensive jewelry. It was the kind of thing someone does when they're planning to run. 2 days later, on Sunday, he got in his car and drove 30 minutes to the U.S. Canada border. He attempted to cross into the United States, but he was turned away. To the border guards, he was a collection of red flags. A single man traveling alone, carrying a large amount of cash and valuables, and acting extremely nervous. He fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and they denied him entry. Frustrated, Blair drove back home. The next day, Monday, he showed up at his construction site and walked straight into his boss's office. He abruptly announced that he was quitting, effective immediately. He didn't even bother to pick up his final paycheck. He just turned around and walked away. From the construction site, he went directly to the airport. There, he walked up to a ticket counter and purchased a round-trip ticket to Frankfurt, Germany for $1,600. No one knows for sure why he wanted to go to Germany, but he had worked there briefly the year before. His flight was scheduled to depart the following day, on Tuesday. But as soon as he bought the ticket, Blair seemed to change his mind again. He suddenly decided he needed to try and get into the United States one more time. He rushed from the airport to a female friend's house. When she opened the door, she was shocked by his appearance. He looked completely disheveled and terrified. He told her, "Someone's trying to kill me. I need your help. Can you drive me across the border? They just rejected me a couple of days ago. You have kids. It'll look more convincing if I'm with a family." His friend was seriously spooked by his frantic behavior and told him she couldn't help. So Blair went home and hid out for the rest of the day. The next morning, Tuesday, he went back to the airport. But instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, he went to the ticket counter and asked for a refund. He told the agent that the person he was supposed to meet in Germany had gotten sick, so he couldn't go. The only person this could have been was a woman he had a brief fling with while working there the year before. But later, when investigators spoke to this German woman, she told them she hadn't been in touch with Blair at all and was definitely not expecting him to visit. After getting his refund, Blair left the airport and went to a car rental agency where he rented a Nissan Altima. He immediately drove back to the U.S. Canada border, and this time, for whatever reason, he was allowed to cross. He drove south to Seattle, Washington, went straight to the airport there, and simply abandoned his rental car in the middle of a parking lot. He then went inside and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. The ticket cost him $770. He could have bought a round-trip ticket for about half that price, but he specifically chose the more expensive one-way option. He boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was on the other side of the country in Washington, D.C. As soon as he got off the plane, he rented another car, this time a Toyota Camry, and started driving again. He drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair wasn't seen in Knoxville until around 5:30 that evening when he pulled into a gas station. He told the attendant that he was having trouble with his car. The attendant came out to take a look, and he immediately figured out the problem. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to the Nissan Altima he had abandoned in Seattle. The attendant pointed this out, but Blair, clearly confused, held up the key and insisted, "No, this is the one I was using." The attendant pointed to the Nissan logo on the key. Together, they searched the car inside and out, looking for the missing Toyota key, but it was nowhere to be found. Blair tried calling the rental company, but their office was already closed for the day. The gas station attendant told him there was nothing more he could do and that they would have to tow the car. But he offered to give Blair a ride to a nearby hotel. Blair accepted. Just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front doors of a Fairfield Inn. Hotel security footage captured what happened next. He walked in, stood in the lobby for a moment, then turned around and walked right back out. A few minutes later, he walked in again, and then walked out again. He did this over and over 5 separate times over the course of an hour. Finally, he approached the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk clerk later told police that Blair seemed completely paranoid. He was constantly looking over his shoulder and was visibly on edge the entire time. She gave him his room key, he paid in cash, and then instead of going up to his room, he turned around, walked out the front door one last time, and never came back. The next morning, 2 construction workers arrived at their job site, which was located in a vacant lot directly across the street from the Fairfield Inn. As they started their day, they discovered a body. It was Blair Adams. He was lying on the ground, and strangely, he was missing his shoes, his socks, and his pants. He had several scratches on his hands and face, but none of the injuries were life-threatening. Scattered on the ground all around his body was $4,000 in a mix of American, Canadian, and German currency. His fanny pack, full of all the expensive gold and jewelry from his safety deposit box, was also lying nearby. A black duffel bag containing maps and travel receipts was on the ground. And also, lying in the dirt, was the missing key to the Toyota Camry. An autopsy was performed, and the medical examiner determined that Blair had died from a single massive violent blow to his stomach that had ruptured his organs. They had no idea what could have caused such an injury. A toxicology report came back clean. There were no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only piece of forensic evidence found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was found clutching tightly in his fist. There were no witnesses to the attack, but a security guard at a nearby business reported hearing a woman's scream coming from the direction of the lot at around 3:30 that morning. The only real lead police had was a composite sketch of a man who several people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant shortly after he had left the hotel for the final time. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were completely baffled. Was Blair telling the truth all along? Had someone been hunting him for weeks, finally catching up to him in a vacant lot in Tennessee? If so, why didn't they take the thousands of dollars in cash and valuables that were lying right next to his body? Or was Blair suffering from a severe paranoid delusion, and his death was the result of a random, tragic encounter with a violent stranger? To this day, we still have no idea. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We often think of danger as something obvious, like a dark alleyway in a bad part of town or a steep cliff edge during a storm. We think we can see it coming, and we believe that as long as we make sensible decisions, we will be perfectly fine. But the truth is that sometimes the most terrifying dangers are the ones that are completely hidden in plain sight, lurking in places that seem entirely peaceful or even fun. A beautiful beach where the sand seems solid as concrete, a calm river winding through a picturesque town, or a beloved amusement park where families go to laugh and make memories. In these places, a single split-second decision, a minor oversight, or just a few moments of bad timing can transform an ordinary day into an absolute nightmare. When these moments happen, the victims usually have no idea they are walking directly into a trap until it is far too late. Today, we are going to look at 3 stories of people who went into places they thought were completely safe, only to find themselves facing a reality that was far more terrifying than they ever could have imagined. On Monday, the 23rd of May 2005, 37-year-old John Wilson got home from an extremely long and exhausting day at work. John was an oil pipeline inspector in Houston, Texas, and that day it had been incredibly hot. He spent the entire day driving around to all these different job sites, standing out in the sun, and dealing with the pressure of keeping everything running safely. He really had not had a break all day, and so now that he was home, he was totally exhausted. Every logical part of his brain told him that he should probably just go straight to bed. But the problem was, John did not want to. He did not want to just go right to bed and then have to get back up again and go right back to work. He wanted to unwind and do something he truly enjoyed before calling it a night. And so John decided that what he would do to unwind would be to go fishing, which was something he really loved to do. Normally, John did a lot of freshwater fishing in the lakes and ponds around Houston, but tonight he decided he would do some saltwater fishing. At about 7:30 that night, he walked out to his garage, grabbed his favorite fishing rod and his tackle box, threw them in the back of his pickup truck, and then he hit the road. About an hour and a half later, John had driven all the way south to the very coast of Texas to a beach called Crystal Beach, which is located right on the Gulf of Mexico. Instead of parking in one of the parking spaces in the lot, John did what he always did. He drove his pickup truck right through the gate and out onto the actual beach. This beach actually had a reputation for having extremely hard-packed sand, almost like cement, because so many people like to drive their vehicles out onto the shore. John drove straight out towards the water, enjoying the open space and the cool night air. Although the tide was not completely low yet, it was slowly making its way towards low tide, which meant there was a lot of dry beach exposed. John drove for quite a while and then he parked. He positioned his truck still in the tidal zone, but well away from the water. John probably figured that he would not be there long enough for it to matter because high tide was not for several hours. And so John hopped out of his truck, prepped his fishing rod, and walked out into the actual surf. He cast his line and began to fish. It would have been very, very peaceful down there. There was not really anyone else on the beach, as it was pretty much the middle of the night. There might have been a couple of other fishermen way down the shoreline, but that was about it. For a while, John probably just enjoyed the peace and quiet, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the waves. But after a while, John got overwhelmingly tired. Maybe it was from all the hard work earlier in the day out in the sun that was finally catching up to him, or maybe it was all the moving around in the surf, getting knocked around by the water that was making him tired, or maybe it was both. But either way, John decided he wanted to take a short nap before he headed home again. He did not want to sleep in the cab of his truck because it was too hot and stuffy, and he wanted to enjoy the cool sea breeze. So he left the surf zone, dropped his fishing rod in the back of his truck, and then he crawled underneath his truck to take a nap on the sand, using the chassis as a shield from the damp night air. The following morning, a man who was out for a walk near Crystal Beach looked out into the water and saw a pickup truck half submerged in the surf zone. He immediately knew something was wrong, so he called the police. When the police arrived, they realized they could not easily get to the truck, so they called a tow truck. The tow truck driver showed up to the beach, but when he got there, it was still relatively high tide. He had to wait for a couple of hours until the tide went down enough that he could actually walk out, attach the chains, and start pulling this truck out of the surf zone. Finally, when it was low tide enough, the tow truck driver walked down to the truck, but as soon as he was standing next to this partially submerged vehicle, his heart sank. He saw there was a body poking out from underneath the truck, and that body belonged to John Wilson. No one knows for sure what happened to John after he climbed underneath his truck, but the best guess is that after he went under there, he fell into a very deep sleep and slept for much longer than he anticipated. In that time frame, even though the sand of this beach had a reputation for being really, really hard, something critical changed. As the tide slowly began to turn and rise, the water started to seep up through the sand from below. When water mixes with packed sand, it causes the sand to lose its solid structure and behave like a liquid, a process known as liquefaction. Over a couple of hours, his heavy truck would have begun to sink into the softening sand. It settled lower and lower, and so John, as he was laying there, at some point would have been trapped by the underside of his truck. From that point, either the truck just continued to settle, ultimately crushing John to death, or it kept him pinned there while he was still alive, and then the tide came in, and eventually he drowned. Either way, John's final moments must have been absolute torture, and a peaceful night of fishing ended in unspeakable horror. Our next story takes us to Sevnica, which is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia. It is situated right along the scenic Sava River, which is one of the longest and most beautiful rivers in all of Europe. For decades, the section of the Sava River that flows past Sevnica was a highly popular destination for kayakers and canoeists who love to paddle through the calm, peaceful waters. But that all changed in 2008 when a massive hydroelectric dam was built across the river. This dam created a complete dead end for anyone trying to go through that section of the river. Boaters would have to stop at the dam, get out of their boats, walk all the way around the massive concrete structure, and then pick up the river on the other side. For many locals, this marked the end of a long and beloved tradition. In 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Sevnica, who was a strong supporter of the dam's construction, understood that this was a bit of a boomer for the people in town. While the dam itself was going to provide a lot of clean electricity for the community, it did mark the end of an era. And so he decided he would organize a final historic trip down the Sava River past the dam while they could still go right past it. He was calling this trip the Final Descent. He went all around town, talking to local leaders and residents, asking if they wanted to join him on this final journey. He eventually recruited 27 other people to come with him, making a total group of 28 eager participants. A few weeks later, on the 3rd of July 2008, after all the preparations were completed, the mayor and the rest of his crew made their way upstream to a loading area where 4 large canoes had been set out for them. The staff people who had actually provided these canoes offered the group life jackets, but remarkably, virtually everyone in the group turned them down. It is unclear why they refused the life jackets, but one could guess that because the river itself was incredibly calm and smooth, and because they were not expecting to be on the water for very long, they simply decided they did not need them. They felt perfectly safe. And so, after all 28 people got into their canoes, with exactly 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and began their slow, peaceful trip down the river. The mayor had even hired a professional photographer to come along with them to document their journey. As soon as they took off, the photographer was looking around, taking pictures, and filming the group. The weather was beautiful, the water was completely calm, and everything was going perfectly. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, the canoes turned a corner and they got a clear view of the massive dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now, the dam was not completely finished yet, but it was pretty close to being done. The actual concrete structure was built, and even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious that up ahead, there were these big cement archways where the river water flowed down over the dam. The whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to what the mayor had told everyone, was that they would get to this dam, but on the left side, there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because the dam was not fully complete, the construction crew had told the mayor that there would be an area on the left side where they could basically just casually float right past. They would not have to go down the dam, and it would be totally safe. But here they were, on the water, looking at the dam, and even from 1,000 feet away, it was obvious there was no side way to get around the structure. The dam went from one bank to the other, completely blocking the river. They clearly had to go through the dam, or they had to get out of the water and walk around it. Now, the river was moving very, very slowly, and there was not a strong current. This meant there was no urgent, panic-induced decision that needed to be made. The group intuitively knew that the right choice here was to go to the side of the river, get out of their canoes, and either carry their boats around or just end the trip right there. But the mayor and a few of the other people in the leading canoes got another idea. They looked at the dam and thought, why don't we just go over it? I know we are not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said not to go over it because it is extremely dangerous, but from the looks of it, it does not look that bad. And truthfully, to an untrained eye, it did not look too bad. This was not some massive waterfall or an enormous dam with a huge drop-off. It was actually a pretty small dam where the water went down a fairly short concrete embankment. It was maybe 10 or 15 feet long, and at the bottom of this embankment, the water was a little bit rough and foaming, but overall, it looked like it might actually be fun. It looked like going down a giant slide with a canoe. And so, the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be an exciting adventure, a perfect highlight for their final descent. Before long, the people in 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over the dam. The 4th canoe, which contained the photographer, was not prepared to go over. They said they were not comfortable with it, but they agreed to pull up next to the dam on the shore, get out, and film the other 3 canoes going over the side. They thought it would make for some incredible footage. After making their plans, the 4 canoes continued down the river. When they got about 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to the dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off to the left side of the river. They got out, and the photographer lifted up his camera and began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their final approach. The video from this photographer, which was later released to the public, shows the first of these 3 canoes actually entering the dam structure. You can see the 7 people in this canoe looking happy and excited. They have a sense of nervous anticipation, like they are about to start a roller coaster ride. They make their way into the dark section inside the concrete archways, where they are going to go down the embankment. But as they go into the darkness and you begin to lose sight of them, you suddenly see the back end of the canoe pop straight up. This was because they had started sliding down the actual dam itself. They start sliding down, and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream. And then the audio goes completely silent and the video just cuts off. What had happened was that as soon as that first canoe hit the churning water at the bottom of the slide, the violent currents immediately flipped the boat over, throwing all 7 people into the freezing water. They did not even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under. This was not just because the water was rough and churning, but because this was a hydroelectric dam. At the bottom of the dam, underneath the water where they had been thrown, were all these massive openings to underwater tunnels. These tunnels functioned like incredibly powerful vacuums, pulling massive amounts of water down inside to run past the turbines, causing them to spin and generate electricity. Even though the dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them were fully active. The suction was inescapable. As these 7 people were dumped into the water, they were dragged deep beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the other 2 canoes had no idea what was happening to the first boat. Because of the concrete walls and the roaring sound of the water, they could not see or hear the disaster. And so, they just continued on and went over the dam. The second canoe went down the slide and also immediately capsized at the bottom. All 7 of its occupants were thrown out and sucked down underwater almost instantly. The third canoe that went over the dam, however, did not capsize. By some miracle, they managed to stay upright. After they cleared the slide and paddled away from the turbulent foam, they began looking around for the other 2 canoes that should have already been down there. But there was nobody in front of them. They turned around, thinking maybe the others were closer to the dam. But then, they saw the horrifying reality. One of the canoes was completely flipped over, and the other canoe had been violently broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam. They saw shattered pieces of wood getting tumbled around in the foam. The occupants of this third canoe immediately turned around and tried to paddle over to the base of the dam to start pulling people out of the water. But when they got over there, there was no one to save. The 14 people who had been in those first 2 canoes had completely vanished. Ultimately, 13 of those 14 people would perish that day. The only person who fell into the water and survived was actually the mayor's wife. By some miracle, she managed to swim out of the powerful grasp of the underwater tunnels and made it to the shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers searched the river and eventually found all 13 bodies. One of the victims had been carried 25 miles away, all the way to Croatia. The public never knew if being sucked through the underwater turbines played a direct role in their deaths, but the tragedy left a permanent scar on the community, a painful reminder of a celebration that went horribly wrong. Our third and final story takes us back to the summer of 1974 in Anaheim, California. 18-year-old Debbie Stone had just graduated from high school and landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland, which was known as the happiest place on Earth. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings, which had opened just 9 days prior. Disney had basically converted an old carousel building, which featured a floor that rotated in a giant circle, into a rotating stage show. They put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages. On each of these 6 stages, they placed different sets of robotic animals that played different songs about American history. The way this worked for the audience was that they would walk into a theater and sit down, and they would see one of these 6 stages right in front of them. The robotic animals would perform a short musical act, and then the entire stage would rotate, bringing the next stage in front of the audience. The audience would remain seated in their chairs until all 6 stages had rotated past them. Debbie's job at America Sings was to welcome the guests at the start of the show. She would walk out onto the stage, give a friendly introduction, and then step off as the show began. Once all 6 acts were finished, Debbie would walk back out onto the stage, say goodbye to the audience, and guide them toward the exit doors. It was a simple, fun job, and Debbie loved it. On the 9th of July, 1974, Debbie was asked to work an evening shift. She arrived at the attraction around 10 o'clock that night, right as a new show was starting. She went inside, hopped on stage, greeted the audience with her bright smile, and then stepped back into the wings as the show began. For the next 30 minutes, all 6 stages performed their acts. After the final performance was over, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage, said goodbye to the crowd, and then, as the audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Behind each of the 6 stages was a large circular room in the center of the building that was used for storage and maintenance. This center room was completely stationary. It did not move. The outer ring of stages and their tall back walls rotated directly around this stationary center room. The gap between the outside of this center room and the inside of the rotating back walls of the stages was extremely narrow, measuring only a couple of inches. It was a massive pinch point, and if a person got stuck back there, it would be highly dangerous. However, Disney had not put any physical safety guards, warning sensors, or emergency shutoff switches in place. They had simply told their staff to be careful and not to go back there. As Debbie walked toward the back of the stage that night, intending to move to the adjoining stage, something went terribly wrong. In the dim light, she either tripped, lost her balance, or misjudged her footing, and she fell directly into the narrow gap between the 2 back walls. Debbie was immediately wedged tightly between the stationary center wall and the back of one of the rotating stages. She tried desperately to pull herself out, but she was completely stuck. She began to panic and started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. But the timing was tragic. At that exact moment, a new crowd of loud, talking guests was walking into the theater, and the loud, cheerful theme music of the attraction began playing. Debbie's screams were completely drowned out. The new audience members in the front rows did hear a faint, muffled screaming sound, but they simply assumed it was a realistic sound effect or a pre-recorded part of the show. And then the automated system started, and the massive, heavy stages began to rotate. Because Debbie was trapped in the tiny gap, the physical force of the rotating stage was absolutely immense. As the stage began to turn, she was forcibly dragged, twisted, and rolled through the narrow space. Her bones began to break, and she suffered catastrophic internal injuries as the heavy machinery relentlessly forced her body through the gap. But remarkably, Debbie did not die instantly. When the stage finally finished its rotation and locked into place, she was still alive, trapped in the dark, and in absolute agony. She used every bit of strength she had left to continue screaming for help. But once again, the music was too loud, and everyone assumed the screams were part of the show. A few minutes later, the act was completed, and the stage rotated again, crushing and dragging Debbie's broken body a second time. It was only at the end of the entire show when a concerned guest finally alerted the staff about the persistent screaming that anyone went to check. They turned on the lights, looked into the gap, and discovered Debbie's lifeless body. The news of Debbie's tragic death sent shockwaves through the community and the theme park industry. Her family was completely devastated, unable to comprehend how their vibrant young daughter could have died in such a horrific manner at the happiest place on Earth. Disney ultimately reached a small financial settlement with Debbie's family. Following the tragedy, the America Sings attraction was closed for several days while engineers installed advanced safety sensors, physical barriers, and emergency cutoff switches to ensure that no human being could ever access that dangerous gap again. The ride eventually reopened, but the memory of that terrible night lingered in the minds of the staff for decades. These three tragic stories serve as a powerful and deeply sobering reminder of the fragile nature of human life. In every single one of these cases, the victims were completely ordinary people who were simply trying to enjoy their lives, work their jobs, or have a little bit of fun. None of them woke up that morning thinking they were embarking on their final day on Earth. John Wilson just wanted to relax by the ocean after a hard day of work. The mayor of Sevnica and his friends just wanted to celebrate their local river and have an adventure. Debbie Stone was just doing her job, welcoming families to a place of joy. But in each case, they fell victim to dangers that were completely hidden or severely underestimated. It is a reminder to always respect the environments we enter, to never take safety for granted, and to remember that danger can lurk in the most unexpected and peaceful places. After hearing stories like these, it's hard to look at safe places the same way again. If you're curious how deep that idea goes, there's more waiting for you on the channel. See you in the next one. Two classmates called Carol and Reggie discovered what seemed to be the ideal love for each other in the early 1960s while they were walking through the hallways of a high school in South Carolina. During the breaks between courses, they were the kind of pair that you would find in old yearbooks. They were always smiling, holding hands, and whispering secrets to each other. They were practically inseparable while they were not schooling together. But despite the fact that their young love appeared to be flawless, it was a chapter that came to a conclusion. The dreams that they had and the expectations that they had about what their futures should be like were different. So, upon the completion of their education, they went their separate ways. He moved to the United States Navy, and then spent the subsequent years serving in various locations throughout the world. At some point during that period of time, he entered into a marriage, but it was a marriage that ended almost as fast as it had begun. Following his discharge from the military, he went back to his birthplace in South Carolina and found a position with a railroad firm that he knew he could rely on. His existence was calm and unchanging. In contrast, Carol's life went through a significantly more turbulent course. She too got married after she graduated, and then she divorced her husband. Subsequently, she went through a second marriage and another divorce. This second marriage that ended in failure would eventually lead to a situation that came dangerously close to taking her life. Carol and her daughter Rhonda, who was 10 years old at the time, were spending the 18th of February in the year 1987 inches, South Carolina. There was a knock at the door on that particular day. It was her second husband, with whom she had a strained relationship. She did not utter a single word as Carol opened the door for him. Right there in front of her young daughter, he pulled out a revolver and shot her 6 times for no apparent reason. Following the assault, he turned around and fled the scene. He was subsequently discovered by the police inside his vehicle, which was parked on the side of the road. The individual had committed suicide. By some miracle, Carol was able to be saved by the medical staff. However, the harm had already been done. She sustained injuries that would remain with her for the rest of her life. As a result, she was blind in one eye and endured persistent, ongoing discomfort throughout her life. It was necessary for her little daughter, Rhonda, to mature quickly because she was expected to take on the duty of a full-time caregiver for her mother. Carol displayed an extraordinary amount of resilience during the subsequent 8 years. Her condition gradually improved, and she was able to restore some of her independence as a result. However, just as she was beginning to feel that things were beginning to return to a more normal state, life struck her yet another heartbreaking blow. The year 1995 marked the beginning of her dreadful illness. A number of blood tests were performed on her after she went to visit a physician. It is impossible to fathom the outcomes. Carol was diagnosed with liver cancer. It was discovered that she had received a blood transfusion within the context of the life-saving operation that was performed after she had been shot. Her blood, which had been the same thing that had saved her life, had been contaminated with hepatitis C. She had contracted the virus without anybody knowing about it, and because it had been left untreated for 8 years, it had subtly ravaged her liver and led to cancer. The day that Rhonda's mother came home with the news is one that she remembers very clearly. She simply sat down in a chair and was quite silent for a considerable amount of time. Then, in a voice that was scarcely audible above a whisper, she mumbled to herself, "I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again." This was a terrible and unfair turn of events. Nevertheless, Carol was a warrior in spite of everything that had happened. She made up her mind that she would not allow her injuries or her condition to define who she was. She started seeking for a job, namely one that would allow her to work inside the confines of her physical restrictions. Also, she discovered one. A local television cable business offered her a position as a customer care representative while she worked part-time for the company. It was a job that she took great pride in. For the first time in a very long time, she felt as like her life was finally, truly going back on track. It was the first time she had worked since the attack, and it was the first time she had worked since the attack. A number of years went by. After that, in the year 2000, Carol was working at her desk at the cable business when she received a call on her phone. In the same manner that she answered every other call that came in, she responded to this one with the same kind of professional greeting that she always used. On the other hand, the voice that she heard on the other end was one that she immediately recognized, a voice that she hadn't heard in an entire decade. In a formal introduction, he presented himself as Reggie Sumner. Carol took a momentary pause, her heart most likely jumping a beat. Carol's voice was full of amazement and excitement as she responded, "I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school." She asked him, "Are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina?" And he stated, "Yeah, that's me." Carol's voice was full of both of these emotions. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that could not have been missed. This phone call, which began as a straightforward inquiry to the customer support department, transpired into a conversation that lasted for an hour. The topics that they discussed were broad, their children, the relationships they had been in the past, and the activities they were currently engaged in. There were almost 40 years of existence that they needed to make up for. Just as they hung up, they learned that they were still in close proximity to one another. They had been separated for such a long time that it was only natural for them to make preparations to get together and finally meet each other in person. Afterwards, Rhonda would explain that when her mother returned home that evening, she felt as though she had been a 16-year-old girl all over again. She couldn't stop gushing about how wonderful Reggie sounded, how handsome he still was, and how extremely pleased she was for their forthcoming date. She was giddy with excitement. It was a couple of days later when the date finally arrived. Rhonda was aware of the situation the moment Carol arrived at her house. She had fallen head over herself in love with Reggie once more. Her mother had fallen in love with him. The feeling was shared by both parties. More than half a year after that fortuitous phone contact, Carol and Reggie tied the knot and became husband and wife. After a long separation, they started a new life together as Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. They made a significant choice no more than a year after they had tied the knot. In order to officially retire and enjoy their golden years together, they made the decision to sell their property in South Carolina and relocate to Jacksonville, Florida. The fact that Rhonda's mother relocated was a challenging experience for her. The link between her and her mother was extremely deep because she had been her mother's caregiver for such a long period of time. While all was going on, she couldn't contain her happiness for her. Despite everything that Carol had been through, it appeared as though she had at long last discovered the source of her true happiness, the one true love of her life. Over the course of the subsequent few years, Rhonda and her mother maintained a steady presence in their relationship by talking on the phone nearly every single day. Despite the distance between them, their connection remained as strong as it had always been. When July of 2005 rolled around, however, the daily calls came to an end. After a while, Rhonda's mother stopped picking up her phone. At first, Rhonda made an effort to not be concerned. Perhaps they were absent, or perhaps they were preoccupied with something else. Following the passage of a complete 24 hours, during which neither her mother nor Reggie had communicated with her, she began to feel a growing sense of unease in her stomach. Despite the fact that Reggie was able to provide care for Carol, she was aware that he was not in the finest physical condition himself. In addition to having diabetes that was incapacitating, he had recently fractured his leg, which meant that he was confined to a wheelchair for the most part. Theirs was not the kind of couple that could just up and go on a trip without any prior planning required. In the event that they were going to be absent from the house for a considerable amount of time, they would have recognized the need for assistance and would have contacted Rhonda. Consequently, throughout the course of the subsequent couple of days, Rhonda didn't stop calling their residence. Reggie, she called him. She decided to call her mother. None of the calls were answered, however. At last, after about 72 hours of total silence, she reached a point where she could no longer stand it. After making the decision, she got into her car and drove to Jacksonville, which was a 4-hour drive, in order to personally check on them. The first thing that grabbed her attention when she arrived at their residence was the fact that the automobile that belonged to her mother and Reggie was not parked in the driveway where it was meant to be. That seemed strange to me. As she approached the front door, she noticed that the lights were on inside the house from the outside. She began by knocking, and then she knocked even louder, yelling out for her mother. There was no response to this. The feeling of fear started to take hold of me. As Rhonda turned the doorknob, she was taken aback to see that it was already unlocked. She opened the door by pushing it open and then stepped inside, raising her voice once more to summon her mother and Reggie. The home was devoid of sound. After that, she witnessed him. While they were still inside the house, their cherished puppy, Mikey, a small dog that they took with them everywhere they went, was still there. Her mind was racing. Without Mikey, if they had gone anywhere, where would they have gone? She proceeded to make her way towards the kitchen as she continued to stroll through the peaceful house. The sight of the scene caused the hairs on her arms to rise up as she arrived there. 2 dishes of food were placed on the table in the kitchen. When the food was just sitting there, it appeared as though it had been sitting there for a couple of days, as if they had been in the middle of a dinner only to have it suddenly disappear. There was a heap of filthy dishes left in the sink, and there were pans on the stove that still contained meals that had only been partially cooked. Rhonda was familiar with her mother. The person Carol was really neat and organized. When it came to her house, she was very careful. That she would have left the house in such a mess, with filthy dishes out and food left to decay on the table, is something that she would never, ever have done. Rhonda's head was suddenly riddled with warning signs that were feverishly waving. On one of the kitchen counters, however, she discovered the factor that firmly established her apprehension, the one that informed her that something was dreadfully wrong. Her eyes fell onto the only mobile phone that Reggie and Carol had shared, which was simply sitting there. There was Carol's purse right next to it. In addition to that, there was a collection of pill bottles close by. It turned out to be both of their supplements. Carol's medicine for liver cancer and Reggie's insulin are both included. These were not vitamins that could be skipped. These were medications that could save their lives, and they had to take them each and every day. Without these things, there was no way that they would have left the house or fled the community. There was no way. Rhonda realized at that same instant that this was not a vacation. This was a critical situation. The Jacksonville Police Department received an immediate contact from her, and she quickly filed a report of a missing individual. The incident of the elderly couple who had gone missing quickly became a topic of discussion in the media. There were photographs of Carol and Reggie being shown on local and national networks, and they were begging the public for any information they could provide. But as the days passed, nobody stepped forward to report the incident. One of the only serious leads that the police could pursue was the missing automobile belonging to the Sumners. They disseminated the description of the vehicle throughout the state, and almost immediately they received a report of it. The automobile had been located. The abandoned vehicle was found in a small village in Florida, approximately 1 hour west of Jacksonville. Located off of a lonely dirt road, it had been parked in a fairly quiet place that was partially covered in trees. In spite of the fact that there was nothing contained within it, the detectives saw that the battery had been removed. The fact that this occurred prompted a few of the police to entertain the possibility that the Sumners had, in fact, just driven out from their residence for some reason and had merely gotten into some kind of car difficulty. In spite of the fact that it was a straightforward theory, it was one that would be totally disproved in under 5 hours' time. At that time, the Jacksonville police station was the recipient of a phone call that was really peculiar. It was asserted by the individual on the other end of the telephone that he was one Reggie Sumner. He stated that he had seen the news reports reporting that he and his wife had gone missing, and he wanted to make sure that everything was okay. He explained that everything was a giant misunderstanding, and that they had just gone away for a little while, but that they were fine and would be returning in a short while. When the police heard this call, they instantly became skeptical of the situation. In the first place, the man's voice was completely off. In spite of the fact that he was 61 years old, Reggie sounded like a young man. Simply put, the voice did not fit the bill. His tone, the nonchalant manner in which he discussed the entire scenario as if it were no great deal, was another thing that did not make sense. An officer who was on the line made the decision to put him through a test. When he asked the man, "Are you with your wife Carol?" the man who was on the phone said, "Yep, I'm with her. Here she is." After that, a lady picked up the phone and answered the question. She claimed to be Carol Sumner, but her voice was also much too youthful for her to be that person. Instead of sounding like a woman who was 61 years old, she sounded like she might be 18 or 19 years old. All she did was restate what the initial caller had stated, which was that everything was okay, that they had only been gone for a few days, and that there was no reason to be concerned about anything. She informed the authorities that they could cease their search for them. Subsequent to the conclusion of the call, the investigators were convinced. It is impossible for Carol and Reggie Sumner to be in this situation. In spite of this, they decided to call Rhonda in and have her listen to a recording of the conversation in order to reassure themselves completely. As soon as she became aware of the voices, she began to act without delay. She glanced at the officers and stated, "That's not my mom. And that's not Reggie." At this point, the police were operating under a new assumption that was quite unsettling. There is a high probability that the two young individuals who had called in purporting to be the Sumners were engaged in the disappearance of the young people. The investigation into the phone call was initiated without delay by the authorities in order to ascertain who the caller was and where the call originated from. During the time that they were waiting for those outcomes, they made the decision to look into another perspective. An investigation into the Sumners' financial records was carried out. Almost immediately, they came to the realization that their bank card had been used at an automated teller machine, ATM, in South Carolina, and that it had been used once they had been reported missing. The break was a significant one. They got in touch with the bank and asked for the footage from the security camera that was installed at the specific ATM at the time of the withdrawal. It was confirmed that their assumptions were correct when they obtained the footage and watched it. Neither Carol nor Reggie Sumner were the ones who took out the money. Some unknown young man, most likely in his early 20s, was the person in question. In the immediate aftermath of this finding, the results of the phone trace were returned. It did not lead anywhere. Under a fictitious name and at a fictitious address, the phone number was registered online. However, the trace was not a complete lost item. With its assistance, the authorities were able to obtain the full call logs from the phone. As they went through the records, they discovered that the person who had been using this mobile phone had recently made a call to a car rental firm that was located in South Carolina. As time went on, the parts began to come together. A call was placed to the rental firm, and the manager was contacted by the police. They were able to verify that a person who had called and rented a car using that mobile phone number had in fact completed the transaction. It was also found that the description of the hired car was identical to the description of the car that the unidentified man was driving on the security film of the ATM. Their getaway vehicle had been located by the cops. The car, however, had not been rented to a male customer. A woman had rented it out until that point. It was Tiffany Cole who was her name. Following then, the rental firm provided the authorities with yet another vital piece of information. Those satellite tracking systems were installed in each and every one of their vehicles. By utilizing this information, the law enforcement officials were able to monitor Tiffany's rental car in real time. Back in South Carolina, they followed the signal until they arrived at a motel. According to the detectives, their first idea, or at least their hope, was that it was possible that the Sumners were being held against their will in that hotel room. A group of law enforcement officers was assembled with a sense of urgency. 6 days after Carol and Reggie were officially reported missing, on the morning of July 14th, law enforcement officers arrived at the motel where they were staying. They proceeded to the front desk where they discovered the room in which Tiffany was registered, obtained a key, and then went up to the hotel. The door was opened when they made their presence known to the people within. There was no sign of the Sumners inside. The cops, on the other hand, discovered 3 young adults simply sitting there. Tiffany Cole, who was 24 years old at the time, was the individual who had hired the vehicle. She was accompanied by her lover, Michael James Jackson, who was 23 years old. Alongside them was his friend, Alan Wade, who was 19 years old at the time. The space was a complete mess, with dozens of shopping bags stuffed with items that had been acquired in the most recent time period. In addition to perfume, there were also brand new computers, video games, and pricey clothing. And in addition to all of the new things, the police discovered 2 very specific items: the key to the vehicle that Carol and Reggie Sumner owned, as well as Reggie Sumner's precious coin collection. These 3 individuals were hauled back to the station by the law enforcement officers, where they were placed in separate questioning rooms. Everyone who was engaged could not deny the fact that these 3 individuals were involved in the disappearance of the Sumners in some way. The key to their vehicle, their property, and the money that they possessed were all in their possession. Not only was it no longer the question for the police to establish a connection between them and the crime, but it was also the matter of how to convince them to reveal the location of Carol and Reggie. All 3 of them were first uncooperative with one another. On the other hand, they either refused to talk or denied having any knowledge. Tiffany began to show signs of weakness as a result of the protracted and intensive questioning. Although she conceded that they had looted the Sumners, she asserted that this was the only thing that they had done. There is nothing else. In addition to this, she informed them that there was a fourth individual who had been involved in the heist. This individual was a friend of Alan Wade's named Bruce Nixon, who was 19 years old. The police soon proceeded to Bruce's house, gathered him up, and brought him in for interrogation as well. Bruce was another person who resided in the neighborhood. On the other hand, in contrast to the other three, Bruce gave in nearly entirely. He divulged all of his information to the authorities. And the account that he recounted, the reality about what happened to Carol and Reggie Sumner, was so horrifying that it caused a number of the experienced detectives who were engaged in the case to shed tears. From what he said, everything began with Tiffany. During the time when the Sumners were still residing in South Carolina, it was discovered that Tiffany had been next-door neighbors with them. Tiffany had a difficult childhood because her father was unable to recover from his illness. She was taken in by the Sumners, who, being the kind-hearted people that they were, had taken her under their leadership. They took care of her, developed a deep bond with her, and treated her in a manner that was almost identical to taking care of one of their own kids. They were always there for her whenever she required anything, whether it was money to buy food or simply someone to talk to. They were very supportive of her. Take, for instance, the fact that they sold an automobile to Tiffany in the year 2001, just prior to their relocation to Florida. However, they sold it to her for a price that was almost insignificant because they were aware that she was in desperate need of a car and that she did not have any money. They were exactly like that. Exactly 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was in Jacksonville, Florida, where she was partying with Michael James Jackson, who had recently become her boyfriend. After being kicked out of the residence they were residing in, they found themselves in a situation where they had nowhere else to go. They had been staying with some friends. They had no money, and they were unable to find a hotel. And it was at that moment that Tiffany's mind began to generate an idea. It was the Sumners that she recalled. She recalled that they had relocated to Jacksonville, and she recalled how they would continue to assist her in any situation regardless of the circumstances. As a result, the two of them arrived at the residence of the Sumners. They arrived in the middle of the night without prior notice and simply knocked on the door when they had arrived. Despite the fact that she was weary and bewildered when she arrived at the door, Carol's face lit up when she saw that it was Tiffany. She warmly embraced her and said, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long." "Come in, come in." "And who are you?" "Michael? It's great to meet you." "Come on inside, I'll get you some food, we'll get you fed." "What do you need?" "What can we do for you?" Tiffany informed them that their preparations had been unsuccessful and that they did not have a place to stay for the night. She inquired as to whether or not I would be able to remain with them. Carol and Reggie answered, "Absolutely, no problem. You guys are our guests. You're welcome to stay as long as you want." That evening, Carol prepared a substantial lunch for them, and they all sat around the table talking. There was no hesitation in their language. During the course of their conversation, Carol and Reggie began discussing the possibility of selling their property in South Carolina, which they had previously owned. The fact that they had made a profit of $99,000 from the sale was something that they mentioned with a sense of pleasure and relief. Because of this, they were overjoyed because it meant that they would finally be able to retire in comfort and without any concerns regarding their finances. Tiffany and Michael exchanged a few fleeting glances with each other across the table as soon as those words left their mouths when they were sitting at the table. At that very instant, the germ of a dreadful notion was planted in the seed. They were well aware that they needed to return and rob them. Carol and Reggie were both up and about early the following morning. They brewed coffee and prepared a substantial breakfast in the expectation that Tiffany and Michael would remain for the duration of the day and spend additional time with them. Tiffany and Michael, on the other hand, were in a high rush to depart. They expressed their gratitude, informed them that they needed to get on the road, and then they went. Almost immediately after they got back into their vehicle, they began making plans. They started talking about how they were going to return, how they were going to rob the old couple who had just taken them in, and how they were going to get their hands on that $99,000. They were going to do all of these things. After a month had passed, on the evening of July 8th, they successfully put their plan into action. Following the completion of all of their preparations, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade arrived at the residence of the Sumners and knocked on the door. It was Carol who was there when the door opened. Both of the young men who were standing on her doorstep were individuals that she did not recognize. However, because she was the lovely and kind person that she was, she simply smiled and asked, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" This was precisely what Tiffany had advised them to anticipate. She had been telling them that this pair would be very simple to take advantage of. An act of rehearsing was performed by Bruce and Alan for Carol. They informed them that their vehicle had broken down just a few blocks away and that they needed to use her phone in order to call for assistance. Despite the fact that Carol had some reservations, she ultimately decided to put her faith in the situation. That was her response. "Sure, come on in." Consequently, Bruce and Alan entered the house, and the entrance door closed behind them just as they entered. As soon as it was closed, one of them took out a fake gun and removed it from its cover. Although it was a replica, it appeared to be a terrifyingly real thing. At the same time that the other man was beginning to bind Carol with cord and duct tape, he displayed it to her. Carol began to scream, making as much noise as she could despite her discomfort. Reggie, who was outside in the garage and unable to see what was going on, was able to hear her cries in the distance. He rushed into the home to find out what was wrong, and as he entered, he ran right into the two men. They launched an assault on him right away. Because of his fractured leg and his fragile health, Reggie did not have a chance of winning. However, he was unable to put up much of a fight. In a short amount of time, both he and his wife were held on the couch in their living room and bound with tape. After that, their kidnappers put duct tape around their heads repeatedly until everything was covered, with the exception of a small gap that they cut under their nostrils so that they could breathe. While the couple was absolutely helpless, one of the men sent a text message to Michael, who was waiting just down the road with Tiffany inside the rented car. Michael was waiting for them right there. Text was easy to understand. It simply stated, "All clear." This was the indication that was given. It indicated that Michael might now aid them with the robbery by coming up to the house and assisting them. Tiffany did not leave the vehicle and remained there to serve as the watchman. Michael made his way up to the house, entered it, and then he, Bruce, and Alan started to meticulously search through the house after he had entered. During the time that these three men were moving from room to room and removing all of their things, Carol and Reggie were undoubtedly thinking that despite how terrible this situation was, they would make it through. Following their departure, the men would take what they desired, and then they would feel better. However, once the three men had finished taking everything of worth, they came to a decision that altered the course of events permanently. A decision was made that they would also take Carol and Reggie with them. They lifted the hapless couple to their feet and marched them out into the garage as they emerged. After that, they compelled them to enter the trunk of their own vehicle. At this moment, Bruce departed from the residence of the Sumners, strolled down the road, and then re-entered the rental car with Tiffany. Michael and Alan entered the vehicle that belonged to the Sumners, and Carol and Reggie were secured inside the trunk. First, the two vehicles came together on the road, and then they started driving. Over the course of approximately 40 minutes, they traveled in a northwesterly direction, crossing the border into Georgia. They made a turn onto a road that was accessible only by a remote access and continued driving down it until they reached a very distant part of the forest. It was not just a random location that they happened to find themselves in. This was a previous location that was chosen. When it was time to prepare it, Tiffany and the others had already been out to this very location 2 days before. Digging a grave was the action that they had taken in order to get it ready. The Sumners have a grave to mourn. Immediately adjacent to the newly excavated pit, Michael and Alan, who were driving the Sumners' automobile, arrived at the scene. Immediately behind them, in the rental car, Tiffany and Bruce reached their destination. After they had all come to a stop, they exited the vehicle and made their way to the rear of the Sumners' vehicle. They opened the trunk ajar with a pop. There is a strong possibility that the temperature within that black metal trunk was significantly higher than 100 Celsius. The moisture had caused the duct tape restraints that Carol and Reggie were wearing to become loose and slip off their wrists and faces. Carol and Reggie were drenched in sweat the entire time. The perpetrators of the crime discovered them sobbing and praying while holding on to each other when the trunk was opened. Following the realization that they were so feeble and afraid, the group came to the conclusion that they did not even require retaping their wrists or faces. There was no way that they were going to leave. They grabbed the two old individuals and yanked them out of the trunk, dropping them on the ground. They then walked away. It was most likely at this time when Carol and Reggie spotted the face of Tiffany among the 4 people who were holding them captive. I can only try to fathom the level of utter anguish that they must have experienced at that very moment. In the most heinous way that could possibly be imagined, this girl, the girl that they had taken in and thought of as a daughter, was betraying them. But there was no time to think about the betrayal that had occurred. Reggie was thrown to the side by Michael as soon as they were on the ground. Michael grabbed him and threw him around. The others grabbed Carol after he yelled at him, "Sit down and don't move. I'm going to kill you and your wife." After that, he continued to kill them. She was dragged away from her husband and brought to the edge of the open grave where she was laid to rest. They ripped the jewelry off of her body rather than putting it on. They pushed her into the hole after they had removed every single valuable item from the location. After that, they made their way back to Reggie, dragged him to the grave, and threw him and his wife into the grave simultaneously. Both of them rearranged themselves as soon as they were in the same grave together. Both of them were seated upright, with one of them in front of the other. Although she was behind Reggie, Carol threw her legs and arms around him, clinging to him for dear life. She was attempting to save her life. With tears in her eyes, she buried her face in his back and began to cry. It would appear that the initial plan was to simply utilize fear to coerce them into divulging all of their banking information. This was successful. During the time that Carol was crying into Reggie's back, Reggie began to beg the group for its assistance. Michael stepped forward and demanded they provide all of their ATM bank card numbers as well as their personal identification numbers, PINs. He pleaded with them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And Reggie, who was adamant about preserving his own and Carol's lives, provided him with every piece of information that he could possibly provide. At this point, the group had effectively stolen everything of value that belonged to this unfortunate couple. Now that they had their possessions, they also had their financial information in their possession. Everything that they could possibly obtain from them was in their possession. Nevertheless, for some reason, that was not sufficient. The Sumners were the target of their decision to eliminate them. And they came to the conclusion that they had to carry it out in the most dreadful manner imaginable. Those individuals were going to be buried alive. Over the course of what must have seemed like an eternity, the group gradually, shovelful by shovelful, started to fill in the hole. Despite the fact that they were still at the bottom, Carol and Reggie were sitting together and pleading for their lives. Nevertheless, the group did not care. All they did was continue to shovel. The earth, which was dense and darkness, piled up around them. In a short amount of time, the muck and dirt had reached up to their necks. The enormous weight of it was pressing down on their chests, making it increasingly difficult for them to breathe. As Carol and Reggie became increasingly aware that they were being gradually crushed, their cries for assistance became more urgent, but they also became more distant from one another. Due to the fact that their breathing was so labored and it was really difficult for them to take a full breath, they were compelled to conserve their air. Due to the fact that the dirt was getting closer and closer to their mouths, they eventually had to tilt their heads upwards and make a concerted effort to take one last deep breath of breathe. On the other hand, once they did that, the murderers started hurling dirt directly onto their faces. They felt themselves choking and gagging as they breathed in the soil. Because of this, it became extremely difficult to take a breath. They were on their deathbed. After that, all of a sudden, an additional layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they vanished completely beneath the soil. In spite of this, the sounds continued. Despite the fact that more and more dirt was being piled on top of them, their whimpers and mumbled cries could still be heard. They were finally successful in filling in the hole. The backs of their shovels were used to begin compacting the dirt as they began their work. Furthermore, even at that time, they were still able to pick up on the faint sounds of the couple passing away beneath the ground. There was a slow, deliberate, and dreadful death that occurred. After they had finished their work, the murderers fled the location. They left the car belonging to the Sumners in the woods of Florida, where it was finally discovered after driving it back to Florida. After that, everyone poured into the rented car together. After driving straight to an automated teller machine, ATM, they took some of the Sumners' money out of the machine and then immediately went on a spending spree. There exists an image of Tiffany Cole that was taken just a few hours after she took part in this heinous deed. After she had killed the very folks who had taken her in and treated her like a doll, she is seen in the picture laughing and partying as if she had no concern in the world. The autopsy performed by the medical examiner revealed the whole tragedy of the Sumners' final moments, which was performed after the bodies of the Sumners were ultimately retrieved. Reggie and Carol both had dirt jammed into their nostrils, mouths, throats, stomachs, and deep within their lungs. They also had dirt packed into their abdominal cavities. Asphyxiation seems to be the true cause of death for them. However, they had been buried alive. Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty in exchange for providing investigators with the complete truth and for directing them to the gravesite where Carol and Reggie were laid to rest. He received a sentence of life in prison. All three of the defendants, Michael Jackson, Alan Wade, and Tiffany Cole, were found guilty, and each of them was given a sentence of death. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham was sitting inside a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio. He was listening to a prosecutor question a witness on the stand. And with every single word this witness spoke, Clement could feel the knot in his stomach twist and tighten just a little bit more. This testimony was not just bad, it was devastating for Clement's client, a man named Thomas McGahan, who was on trial for murder. The murder itself had happened about 6 months earlier on a cold Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGahan had apparently stormed into a saloon with a group of his friends. Their target was another man inside named Tom Myers. An attack broke out, it was loud, it was chaotic, and in the middle of all the shouting and shoving, a single gunshot rang out. When the chaos finally died down, Tom Myers was on the floor, shot and killed. Now, the problem was, there were at least 30 other people in that saloon at the time. But the fight had happened so fast and it was so confusing that not a single person could say for sure that they saw who actually fired the gun. Despite this complete lack of a direct witness to the shooting, almost everyone in town immediately decided that Thomas McGahan had done it. And to be fair, even Clement had to admit that it was a reasonable assumption to make. You see, McGahan and the victim, Tom Myers, had a very long and very public history of not liking each other. It was a well-known feud, and everybody in town knew they hated each other. On top of that, McGahan had a reputation. He was known as a violent criminal, and there were rumors, whispers that he had already killed at least 4 other men in his lifetime. So, when Tom Myers ended up dead after a fight with McGahan, the citizens of Hamilton didn't really feel the need to wait around for a trial. They were ready to form a mob and hang McGahan right then and there. Of course, the local police intervened before that could happen. They arrested McGahan and put him in jail to await trial. But the story of the saloon murder had already spread like wildfire all across Ohio. It was a messy, dramatic case with a notorious defendant, and as a result, the trial itself became a very high-profile event. Every single day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from all over the state, important local figures, and curious members of the public all came to sit in the gallery and listen to the testimony unfold. And right now, all of these important people were sitting there watching Clement's defense case get absolutely obliterated by this one single witness. The witness on the stand was one of the men who had been in the saloon on the night of the murder. And he was making a very, very big claim. He was telling the court that even though nobody saw McGahan fire a gun, he was certain McGahan was the shooter. The witness said that right after the gunshot went off, he looked over and he saw a little puff of smoke coming out of McGahan's jacket pocket. The implication was clear. McGahan had his gun hidden inside his jacket, and he had fired it through the fabric to conceal the weapon. As the witness explained this theory, Clement looked around the courtroom. He saw people in the jury box nodding their heads. He saw journalists in the gallery scribbling furiously in their notepads. It was clear that everyone was buying it. What the witness said seemed to make perfect sense to them. At that point, Clement could tell that basically everyone in that room thought his client was guilty. But Clement did not agree. He knew his client's case looked terrible. He knew the public opinion was stacked against him. But Clement was absolutely certain deep down in his gut that Thomas McGahan was innocent. Clement had his own theory about what had happened that night in the saloon. He believed that the victim, Tom Myers, had actually shot himself by accident. He thought that during the chaotic brawl, Myers had tried to pull out his own gun to defend himself, but in the struggle he fumbled it and the gun went off, killing him. Unfortunately for Clement, this was 1,871. There was no advanced forensic science. There were no ballistics experts or gunshot residue tests. The only piece of physical evidence in the entire case was a few scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt where the bullet had entered. So, the whole trial was really just based on what the witnesses said, and this particular witness was being very, very convincing for the prosecution. The prosecutor finished up his questioning with a confident flourish. He walked back to his table with a little smirk on his face, like he knew he had just landed the winning blow. He had pretty much just won the entire case with that one testimony. Now it was Clement's turn to cross-examine the witness. And honestly, he had no idea how it was going to go. He felt like he was facing a brick wall. But as Clement stood up from his chair and started to walk across the courtroom floor, a strange sense of calm came over him. He was thinking to himself, I really don't have that much to lose here. Pretty much everyone in this state already thinks my client is a murderer. So if he's found guilty, nobody is going to be shocked. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to prove he's innocent. And that would be a huge victory. And if I don't, well, it is what it is. To understand Clement's mindset, you have to know that he was a very controversial figure in Ohio at that time, which was right after the end of the Civil War. During the war, he had been a very vocal opponent of the president, Abraham Lincoln. His political viewpoints had actually gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states for a time. After the war ended, he was allowed to return to his home state of Ohio, and he went back to practicing law. But he had never really been able to fix his damaged public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people in Ohio still really hated him for his behavior during the war. So in his mind, Clement knew that losing this case wasn't going to change much for him personally. Nothing would really change. He'd still be the guy that a lot of people disliked, and his client would be the convicted murderer everyone already thought he was. It is what it is. But if he won, if he could somehow pull off an acquittal in this impossible case, he could completely reinvent himself. He would no longer be the disgraced politician. He would be known as the sensational criminal defense lawyer who could overturn even the most hopeless cases. And again, he genuinely believed his client was innocent. So this would be a major victory on two fronts for Clement. It would be a professional triumph and a personal vindication. So, with this renewed sense of purpose, Clement stepped up to the witness box. He began firing off one question after another at the witness. By the end of the day, Clement had managed to get that witness to admit that he hadn't actually seen a physical gun in McGeehan's hand or in his pocket. He had only seen the smoke. Then, Clement delivered his final blow to the prosecution's theory. He had the jacket that McGeehan had been wearing that night brought into the court as evidence. He showed it to the judge and the jury, and he was able to prove that there was no hole anywhere on it. Not a single tear or burn mark. The jacket shooting theory was completely destroyed. As the week went on, more and more witnesses took the stand. Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGeehan had shot Tom Myers. But, on the other hand, he also couldn't find any solid evidence that proved his client was innocent either. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, but he hadn't built a strong case of his own. So, later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial was coming to a close, Clement was starting to get worried again. He knew that he had done a lot, but he also knew it probably wasn't enough to get his client acquitted. And even though he knew the odds were always stacked against him, he now felt like victory was possible. It was almost within his grasp, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating under his collar as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their closing arguments. And they were brutal. They painted McGeehan as a cold-blooded killer and tore apart every little bit of doubt Clement had tried to create. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. He was just moments away from having to give his own closing arguments. This was his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared was going to be enough, especially not after the powerful and convincing speech the prosecutor was giving right now. And so, as the prosecutor eloquently wrapped up his speech, Clement was furiously crossing out lines on his own notes, trying to rewrite things, trying to make it better, stronger. But nothing was coming to him. He just sat there, racking his brain, trying to think of what to say. The prosecutor sat down, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Everybody was looking at Clement, waiting for him to stand up and deliver his closing argument. And as he sat there in that heavy silence, an idea suddenly hit him. It hit him so hard that he actually dropped his pen on the floor. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier. It was so obvious. He suddenly realized there was a way he could definitively prove McGeehan was innocent. And if he was right, he would go down in history as perhaps the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. Clement lunged for his pen again. He frantically started scribbling down the details of his new idea. A minute later, he heard the judge call his name, telling him it was his turn to speak. And so he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. But instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he did something unexpected. He asked the judge to let him deliver his closing argument on Monday instead. The judge was a little hesitant at first, but after some consideration, he agreed. And when he did, Clement felt a huge surge of excitement rush through his body. After the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of that courthouse fast enough. He had a plan, and he needed to put it into motion. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory, the one he was going to present on Monday, was correct. But he didn't want anyone from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So, after having dinner with some friends, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet, dark streets of Lebanon. While he was at dinner, he had been pretty vague about what he actually planned to do that night. But he did tell his friends that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was that confident in what he was about to uncover. He was sure his speech on Monday would be one of the greatest legal moments in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline. He kept walking faster and faster until he was basically at a full run. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. As soon as he got there, he set up for the test he had planned, and then he ran through it. After he finished, a wide smile spread across Clement's face. He knew, without a single doubt, that he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 o'clock that evening, Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. He just kept pacing back and forth around and around the small room, trying to get his thoughts in order, but he was just too excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he was pacing, he saw his co-counsel, another lawyer on the defense team, walking by in the hallway. This hotel was sort of the home base for everyone who was in town for the trial. So most of the lawyers from both the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside. He tried to tell him what he had figured out, but the words just kind of tumbled out in a jumbled mess. All he really managed to get across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, and that he, Clement, had figured out the truth. But his co-counsel was just looking at him with a confused expression, like he really didn't understand a word he was saying. And so, at some point, Clement realized that words weren't going to be enough. He needed to do a physical demonstration. He needed to repeat the test he had just done out in the field to actually show his co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So, without much more explanation, Clement got up. He set up the test right there in the hotel room. He then turned to his co-counsel and told him to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, something went horribly wrong. During the demonstration, there was a sudden, loud explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers had shot himself by accident, by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory would hold up with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible for that to happen. So, when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do the test by himself for the first time, he had taken a gun with him. He basically experimented with ways the accident could have happened. He shot the gun through pieces of fabric from different angles, and he looked at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, which was the only forensic evidence they had, could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range. This meant that Thomas McGahan, who was standing several feet away during the fight, was simply too far away to have been the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel in the hotel room, that his discovery went from great to perfect. Because completely by accident, he did exactly what he believed Tom Myers had done that night. He fumbled with the gun, and he shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so powerful and so convincing that his client, Thomas McGahan, was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, a 32-year-old composer named Rezo Cherish sat in his small apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He had been at it for hours and hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he managed to jot down a new combination of notes, he would play it back, hate it, and then tear up the sheet of paper and toss it into his trash bin. The bin was already overflowing with a pile of other discarded drafts. Now, Rezo was used to this kind of messy, creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician back in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He had written more than 40 different musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few of them had been really successful. So Rezo knew, deep down, that he had the talent to be a huge star. He believed he could change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different approaches and just letting the messy creative process happen, Rezo still could not come up with any new work that he felt was any good. A big part of the problem was that he was incredibly stressed out. At this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and what the future might hold. There were very violent and hateful political views that were spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the official start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain a lot of power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was deeply worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept him up at night, the more urgent day-to-day worry that was really blocking his creativity was a more practical one: how to literally afford to buy food. The world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and massive unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad, and they were getting worse every day. Banks and businesses were closing down almost daily. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed and living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris, hoping to find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was considered the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing and dark, Rezo thought that the creative energy in Paris would inspire him to create something beautiful in the middle of all the darkness. But now, as Rezo sighed and leaned back in his chair, he looked around his tiny, drafty Parisian apartment. He had been here for months, and his fortunes had certainly not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But Rezo, he kept trying. He would lean back over his piano and try to write, but almost immediately he would tear up the paper. He was just getting more and more frustrated with himself until finally he just gave up. He put his head in his hands and basically said out loud, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and the awful things that were going on in the world, the worse he felt. And obviously, the worse his work was. Right now, he actually almost felt physically sick from bottling up all of these terrible competing feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was bottling everything up, he suddenly decided he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't continue to keep all of that stuff locked inside. And it was at that exact moment that Rezo took a deep breath and he let in all of the anguish that he had been trying so hard to push away. Sadness and fear and a quiet sense of desperation just washed over him and into him. And this time, he didn't fight it. He just let it happen. And then suddenly, he started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of these terrible emotions hit him. When he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written down. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, very sad melody began to fill the small room. It was so beautiful and so incredibly sad that he actually felt like he was going to cry just from hearing it himself. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair. And now, tears were filling his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some fresh air, and fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk. He hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody just continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he had actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own personal sadness that it almost hurt to have created it. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Yo Yavor, who was rushing right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up just a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians living in Paris, trying to make good art and make a name for themselves, but neither of them had really succeeded yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached him, Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. His friend told him that his fiancée had just ended their engagement, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry to hear that, the two men just walked together in silence for a while. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And then, without even meaning to, Rezo just began to whistle the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His friend's eyes welled up with tears, and he sort of began to cry. And also, he began to sing along to the melody using words from a very sad poem that he himself had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it. Without even trying, Laszlo's words were a perfect fit for his melody. And as this sort of impromptu collaboration began, the two men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit down and work out the rest of the song. Before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. The song was about someone whose lover had just died, and their deep desire to be reunited with them in the afterlife, Pakis. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their new song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians if they would play it for them. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed just a few hours ago, was being played throughout the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually started to cry. Others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sad sound. It was exactly what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was to truly and deeply affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this particular tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives for the better. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to different music producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and to record the song. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment, and he waited. He waited for the song to take hold, for it to become a hit, and for the money to start pouring in. But that is not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio. He didn't see it on any music charts. He didn't hear it in other restaurants or being performed in theaters. It was like the song had never even existed at all. And this completely crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because now he had gotten a taste of hope. And it felt so much worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life, and the state of the world, got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong. And as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a major war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further and further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something, anything, to change. 3 years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary. He was walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house. But as he strolled down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window of a nearby apartment. He stopped cold in his tracks, and his heart began to pound in his chest, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song. As far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in it. But it was completely shocking. Someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio. That meant it was being put out on the airwaves, that it was being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there on the sidewalk, letting his own notes wash over him, hearing it out in public for the very first time. And when the song was done, he just stood there for another moment, and just absolutely beamed with joy. After that day, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it being played at social gatherings. He heard it streaming from people's windows. Street performers sang it to people passing by, and it was even performed at big concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of that year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in all of Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the newspapers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had finally realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand. He happened to notice that one of the headlines mentioned his song Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press coverage. So, he immediately grabbed a copy of the newspaper and opened it up to read the article. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach completely flipped. Because this was not good press. In fact, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he must have read it wrong. And so, he read it again, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. But each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. He quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. He saw there were a few other people who were also standing by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed, worried voices and pointing at that same headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. The Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, just staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with a sense of dread, just like he had been every single day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly, there was a sharp knock at his door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police. And they wanted him to come down to the station with them. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves. But at this point, he wasn't really surprised. Because by now, he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific, terrible mistake. Because it would turn out, Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo had thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music, or its written lyrics, or the actual song playing on record players at the scenes of suicides. Dozens and dozens of people across Hungary, across Europe, and in the United States, from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths became so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a public letter to the people begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple official bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop all sales of the song. And Rezo immediately agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner, Laszlo. And Rezo's partner, Laszlo, was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing. Because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the very day he had written the song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows for sure why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate. And the song's popularity was either a terrible coincidence or it served as a sort of unfortunate trigger for those who were already on the edge. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the dark legacy of his song. Even though it did technically live up to his original vision, it did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. It was a nightmare. Over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, the lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates now put the death toll in the hundreds. Although these numbers are very difficult to verify, Rezo never wrote another hit song. And in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out of the window of his 8th floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday, and he died 2 days later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.